All right, now that we've been given the nickel tour, let's try a few things that are fairly basic within the world of programming in C#. The first thing I want to show you is called a comment. A comment is something that you can stick in there that the compiler will completely ignore. So this is used for documentation. It's used for writing little notes to yourself or other programmers, and it's completely ignored by the compiler. So you can put anything you want in here. If you're going to do a single line comment, then just do 2 forward slashes. If you want to do more than one line, you can. If you use /*, I don't want to confuse it. And then you close it with */ like that. So that will let you write longer comments if you want to have something that's on more than one line. So those are the two most common comments that you're going to see. Let's see if this thing supports. No, it doesn't. Okay. Visual Studio has a different one. It's called a documentation comment, but since MonoDevelop doesn't seem to support it, maybe it's 3. Yeah, it does. There you go. Okay, there's also a documentation comment. Ta-da! 3 slashes. And it will go ahead and do that for you on each line. And usually what this is used for, there's a separate tool that you can use to generate documentation for your classes. But that's getting a bit off subject. But you might see all 3 of those, so it's probably a good idea to point you to all 3 of those possibilities. Okay, the next most basic thing is a variable. So let's take a look at a variable. There's 2 different ways to come at this. C# is really based heavily on Java. In fact, a lot of people would say that Microsoft stole Java and then made it better. I wouldn't terribly disagree with that point. I think that's pretty on the nose. But I want to show you the Java way of doing things. Java is very rigid, and C# generally has lots of nice little shortcuts and productivity things that make your life a little bit easier. So I want to show you the Java, the rigid way of doing it, and then I'm going to show you the less rigid C# way of doing things. And some of these features are new as of version 3, version 4 of C#. Really, C# has progressed over the years, and it seems like every time they come out with a new version, they have lots of cool little features in it that make life a little bit easier. Java, on the other hand, has pretty much been the same for almost 2 decades now. They don't change very quickly. So in C# and in Java, you're working with a strongly typed language, which means when you create a variable, you have to tell it what kind of data is going to go into it. As we mentioned in the lecture, there are 3 main types. There are string types, which are alphanumeric characters. There are numeric types, which allow you to do math, and there are Boolean types. So let's take a look at a few examples of each one. The Java way of doing this would have you create a variable with the type. So let's start with a string, since that's the most recognizable. And you'll notice when I start typing, I'm going to get these auto-completion features. That's part of the IDE. Pretty much every IDE has this. If it annoys you, you can hit escape and it'll go away. You can also probably tweak your settings so that it takes a little bit longer for that pop-up to show up. Okay, so we've identified the type. I'm going to call this my string. I could call it anything I want to. It seems like when I do this exercise, there's always a student that says, oh, well, it's a string, so you have to put a string in there. You can call it whatever you want and it will work just fine. So we'll put something ridiculous in there. And let's go ahead and assign it. Okay, so that is a very basic statement. You've got the creation of a variable called myBoogieWoogie. It is of type string, and I am initializing it to the value of booyah. You'll notice at the end, I've got a semicolon. All of your lines in C# code must terminate in semicolons. The exception to that rule are those lines which are brackets. So you don't put a semicolon after your bracket. You just close with the closing bracket. All right, so let's try a few more. Let's try an integer. Yeah, that's the ticket. 39. Sounds good to me. And let's try, how about a floating point? I'm just going to say my decimal number equals 35 points. I don't know. Doesn't matter. Something like that. And let's do a Boolean, just so we've done all the types. So we'll do a bool. We'll do is it true? And we'll set it to true. Okay, so we've got a few things on here now. I've got 4 variables, different types, and there's a couple things you might be noticing. First of all, keywords in C#, these are the words that are reserved to the language, are highlighted in blue, dark blue. Structures, things like classes, access modifiers outside the class, and the namespace, those are outlined in teal. So you've got some color coding going on here. That makes it very easy to spot spelling errors. So if you'd come in here and type this manually, and that isn't teal, you get used to seeing that in teal. It's like, oh, and you got this nice underline, something's wrong. It tells you to go in and fix it. Values that are assigned to variables are depicted in orange. So that's just a nice little way of telling you that's what you're looking at. And then true and false are Boolean values. That's the exception to that. Those aren't orange. Since they're keywords, they're drawn in blue as well. So you've got a few things going on for you. You'll also notice that it is checking for mistakes as you go. So if I had forgotten, one of the things that would tell me if I had forgotten my semicolon is if I hit enter and I wind up in the middle of the line on the next one. You can do multi-line statements, and it assumes that's what you're trying to do here. So it will give you hints if you do something wrong. In this case, I've typed something in there that it considers complete nonsense, and it's going to underline it in red for me. It's going to say, hey, I don't know what this means, so please fix it. If I had attempted to run my program with junk in it that it doesn't understand, it will give me a nice warning. So if I go up here to run, start without debugging, it's going to go, no, I don't think so, buddy. It's going to say, build, there was an error, and it'll give you how many errors there were. And then if you click this, it will open up the errors window. It'll tell you the line that it's on, a description of the error that it discovered, and if you double click this, it should take you right to it. And it does. Okay, so it's saying I have no idea what that means, so let's just take it out. It was illustrative junk. Okay, so now if I try to build my project, I don't have to run it. I can just hit build, and it will tell me whether or not I was successful or not. Okay, we have a problem with our float here. So it says literal of type double cannot be implicitly converted to float. This is one of the things that you're going to run into a lot with programming is conversion between types. And as it happens, floats are kind of funny this way. It can't tell if I mean to be double or float here. So I'm going to tell it explicitly. I'm going to put an F on here. Let's see if that fixes it. Oh, no. These are warnings. Okay, that's different. That's a different animal. Warnings are something that you should correct, but you can live without them. So let's see what our warnings say. Oh, it's going to tell us that it's assigned, but it's never used. Okay, so that's a good feature to have. We've created all these variables and we haven't actually used them for anything, so that's kind of bad. We're taking up memory unnecessarily. But that's okay since we're just illustrating how to create variables. I think we can live with the warnings for now. Okay, so you notice that putting that F in there fixes the problem. That is just a little hint that tells it that it is in fact a floating point number. So if I wanted to, let's say I wanted to use an integer here, like 27. It's not going to understand that. It's going to say, hey, that's an integer right there. I could give it a little bit more of a hint, but what it really wants is for you to tell it with an F that is in fact a float. Okay, so this is the Java way of doing it. It's very rigid. So let's try a nicer way, a kinder, gentler way, if you will. In the newer versions of C Sharp, we have something called implicit typing. That's not to say typing like this. That means typing is in figuring out what kind of variable you're dealing with. It looks a lot like JavaScript. You can type the word var for variable, and then you can say, I'll just call this one implied or implicit type. You'll notice I ran into a keyword there. I can't call it implicit. Oh, better call it implicit type. And this one I'll make into a string. And what's going on here, you may think that this is going to do some weird sort of object voodoo here, and you might be right to think that, but in this case you'd be wrong. What actually goes on here is the compiler looks at this and it says, well, it's obviously a string because that's a string right there. So it goes ahead and it figures out what you're doing based on what you assign here. So for example, I could not do this. I could not fail to assign it. It is completely legal to not assign it. It's just something that I don't teach you how to do because it's a bad idea. You could create a variable of type string like this, and that's legal. And then you could come down here and set it to something. And that's cool. But I think it's more concise to go ahead and set it to something. Plus, I'm a big fan of initializing your variables. If you've worked in C, you know how ugly things can get if you deal with junk that's already in there. So I usually just, as a practice, initialize everything. I think it's just a good idea to do that. And if you go ahead and initialize it in one step, then you can use implicit casts, and it's kind of nice. Okay, so I'll say my string equals booyah, and it can figure it out based on that. Now, if I really wanted it to be empty, I could do string.empty, and that's just a nice little placeholder. Or I could set it equal to an empty string like that. There's a couple of ways to get it done, whichever way you want to do it. So you're going to see it both ways. You're going to see it explicitly and you're going to see it implicitly. It just depends on who's writing the code and what their background is. If they learned Java first and then C Sharp, they might be more comfortable doing it explicitly. If they've only ever learned C Sharp and fairly recent version of the language, then you're probably going to see it more and more implicitly.